Good morning, Humber Valley. My name is Trevor Brisbin, and thank you for being a part of this. So we've got a lot of ground to cover today, so let's just get after it. We've spent the last couple of weeks in the book of Lamentations. It's a collection of 5 poems buried somewhere in the middle of the Hebrew Bible. Lamentations is one of those books where if you blink, you may miss it, but you don't want to miss it because as raw and as comfortable as it is to read, its depth of insight is nothing short of profound. Now, Lamentations was written sometime in the 6th century BC and tells of the anguish and despair of a small Jewish tribe called Judah. As Lamentations is written, Judah has been decimated by a massive military empire called Babylon. People are slaughtered, enslaved, left absolutely dehumanized. Last week, we talked about how these poems are told from the perspective of 3 different voices. There's a narrator, there's a woman who also happens to be the personification of the city of Jerusalem and the tribe of Judah. And then in chapter 3, which we haven't got to yet, we're introduced to the voice of a man. Now, working our way as we did last week through chapter 1, we hear the narrator dispassionately describing just like how bad life had gotten for the woman who's also the city and the tribe. There's not a whole lot of like empathy or sympathy from the narrator. It's just like, here's how terrible it is. This is what their existence is like. We also hear the woman calling out from her exile, like, could somebody please see me? Like, God, do you see me? A friend, a passerby, anyone, somebody see my pain. One of the healthy things we learn from Lamentations is that pain isn't something to be ashamed of. So often we want to like put on a brave face or try and keep a stiff upper lip. We even apologize for our pain, right? Like, I'm sorry I'm not at my best. And Lamentations, if anything, it teaches us that seeing and being seen in the painful moments, in the difficult seasons, isn't something to be embarrassed of. It's human, it's healthy, it's maturity. This morning, as we graduate from chapter 1 and move into chapter 2, there's a couple of things that I think we should notice. Okay? First, in Hebrew, the book of Lamentations is called what? Do you remember from a couple weeks ago? It's called the book of how. Yeah, Lamentations is the Greek name. The Hebrew name is the book of how. Chapter 2 starts with a statement of how. How the Lord has covered daughter Zion with a cloud of his anger. Here at the start of chapter 2, just as the start of chapter 1, we're still talking about the how. How do we process the deepest kinds of pain? The second thing we just want to take note of is the tone the narrator changes significantly from chapter 1 to chapter 2. No longer does the narrator just like report the details, but he begins to see the extent of the woman's suffering as something human, something worthy of his empathy. So in verse 13, he actually switches from like, this happened and then this happened and just sort of reporting the stuff to actually speaking in the first person and coming alongside her in her suffering. Verse 13, what can I say for you, the narrator says? With what can I compare you, daughter Jerusalem? To what can I liken you that I may comfort you, virgin daughter Zion? So he doesn't claim that he can fix her pain. He doesn't try and provide an answer for the pain. But it's like finally, at least someone sees her pain. And in Lamentations, that may be the closest we come to redemption. Because as you read through chapter 2, there's actually an intensifying of sorrow. Like if in chapter 1 you're thinking, how in the world could this woman's suffering get any worse? Chapter 2 says, hold my beer. Like this thing gets rough. So this morning from chapter 2, I want to make 3 observations about pain and about suffering and about how we carry those things. Between verses 14 and 17, we're given a glimpse of just how bad this situation is intensified. And I think there's some really, really important insights here for anyone who feels the disappointment of life or at the very least wants to make the world a little bit better so it doesn't have to be so hard for others. So observation number 1, lies, deception, and the purposeful misleading of others causes harm. Lies, deception, and the purposeful misleading of others causes harm. Listen to verse 14. The visions of your prophets were false and worthless. They did not expose your sin to ward off your captivity. The prophecies they gave you were false and misleading. Lies, deception, and the purposeful misleading of others causes harm. Or if you wanted to put these in the positive, and maybe we should do that this morning, because each of these observations come out of like the negative, which is Lamentations. So let's see if we can put them into the positive to be like things we can act on. So I might frame it like this. Telling the truth, being honest, seeking to speak with clarity and courage is exactly what this world needs more of. The narrator explains that part of why things have gotten so bad for Judah is because the prophets that the people had entrusted to speak the hard stuff about justice and priorities and wealth and power, they abdicated that responsibility. Is it that they didn't want to offend anyone? Is it they only wanted to say the things that people wanted to hear? Did they not want to create any awkwardness, so they thought they would just skip over the difficult and hard stuff? Whatever the reason for not being honest and upfront with Judah, and let's assume that these prophets, the reasons were really well intentioned, but the impact of avoiding the truth contributes to the harm. I think this is one of those realities that is absolutely universal in any environment where relationship happens. Like any family or office or church. Like if you're in relationship in any meaningful way with other people, there will be times when awkward, difficult, clear but truthful conversations will be required. The difference between healthy and mature relational environments and dysfunctional ones is directly correlated to a group's commitment to truth and honesty. And friends, this is so relevant for churches. Because what is church if not like the gathering of really, really nice people who 99.9% of the time have only the best intentions? However, sometimes when we're offended, when someone says something that doesn't land right, when we say something that doesn't land right, when we overreact or misstep ourselves, rather than speaking the truth, to say, you know what, that really hurt, or what was that about? Or hey, look, I'm sorry, I know I messed up there. We have this tendency instead to turn up the public politeness, smile, and pretend everything's okay, while inside the resentment and animosity builds. Are you with me? Blessed are those who choose the honest, truthful, and often awkward conversations over Christian niceness, for theirs is a healthy church. So, observation 1, telling the truth reduces harm. Observation 2, I think I would say observation 2 is this. Don't be a jerk. Although we're shooting for positive, right? So let me try and come at that again. Listen to verse 15. All who pass your way clap their hands at you. They scoff and shake their heads at daughter Jerusalem. So essentially, people are looking at this woman feeling smug because their situation isn't nearly as bad as her situation. And they mock her, they scoff at her. So if we were to frame this in the positive, observation 2 would be this. Recognize Christ in the other. Be Christ to the other. I mean, this is the idea Jesus lays out explicitly in Matthew chapter 25 when he says, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. Whatever you do, you know this one, whatever you do to the least of these, like whatever you do for the one without power, whatever you do for the one in crisis, you're doing that for me. As Judah is suffering, people are walking by scoffing. They feel the need to comment on the suffering of the other. You ever hear someone say, like maybe they see someone who's suffering, someone who's having a rough go, and they'll say something to the effect of, but by the grace of God, there go I. You ever hear someone say that? Have you ever thought about what the implications are of what that means? I mean, I think most people probably mean it in like a trying to be self-deprecating, but by the grace of God, there go I. Like essentially what that's saying is like, I have God's grace and therefore I'm not suffering, but they're suffering because, well, maybe they don't have God's grace like I have God's grace. It's like God gave me grace and you get suffering. Perhaps the most appropriate, you could say the most Christian response when seeing the pain or struggle of another would simply be to circle back to the how, right? Lamentations, how? How can I be God's grace to you in this moment? Like that's a radically different approach to someone's struggle, isn't it? Not comparing grace, but becoming grace. Let's be honest, one of the hardest things is to know what to say when you see someone who's suffering. It's just true, right? I mean, I'm a minister, and at a funeral, at a visitation, at a hospital visit, often I'm terrified of saying the wrong thing. And okay, insider pro tip, don't give this one away. That's why we as ministers always read the 23rd Psalm and pray the Lord's Prayer, because it's safe. Have you ever not gone to a visitation or not reached out to someone you knew who was struggling because you either didn't know what to say or you didn't want to say the wrong thing? Yeah, I mean, I totally get it. What I'm learning is that 10 out of 10 times, hurting people aren't looking for you to make them feel better with your words. I mean, we're all just looking to be seen. We want people to see Christ in us. We want to be reminded that we're not alone in the universe and someone cares. And most of the time, for that, maybe you don't even need to say anything at all. You really just need to show up. So 2 observations so far. The world needs more honesty and more truth tellers. And we're better off when we see Christ in the other and be Christ for the other. One more observation for this morning. And this one, friends, this one matters. I'll put it like this. There is a way to think and talk about God that is toxic and harmful in suffering. There's a way to talk about God that is toxic and harmful in suffering. Verse 17, the Lord has done what he planned. He has fulfilled his word, which he decreed long ago. He has overthrown you without pity. He has let the enemy gloat over you. So that's just troubling. The narrator describes God as purposely and methodically planning out the suffering of Judah and doing it all with no pity. The narrator paints a picture of a God who intentionally causes human suffering. Like it's part of some grand divine plan that people of Judah should suffer in the most unimaginable ways. One of the things that often happens when there's a disorienting degree of pain or sadness or tragedy, we as humans instinctually want to make meaning of it. We want our pain to matter. We want our hurt to count for something. We want to explain why this all is happening. And in the mind of this narrator, Judah is destroyed because God planned for Judah to be destroyed. The suffering and the pain is an integral part of some greater divine plan. That's the narrator making meaning. And 2,500 years later, a lot of really well-meaning Christians have adopted the same kind of thinking. It might not be as explicit as God planned your suffering. It's usually more subtle and cloaked in more spiritual sounding language. Maybe it's a couple who loses a young child. And someone trying to help, trying to mean well, might say, well, God needed another angel. What does that sound like to a grieving parent? God was understaffed, so recruited your child? Like you will live the rest of your life in pieces because God didn't have enough help? Or you ever hear someone say, well, God must be trying to teach you something in the midst of your pain and struggle, right? Like somehow someone's sickness or misfortune or loss is a divine pedagogy. So my mom is a teacher, and my wife Marisol, she's a teacher. And I've been in school long enough to know that imposing suffering or pain as a method of helping someone understand something isn't called teaching. It's called abuse. No teacher of any ability or character would ever consider inflicting pain to teach a student a lesson. If God initiates suffering to teach people stuff, God would be the worst, most immoral teacher there has ever been. Or have you ever heard someone say, just trust this is all part of God's plan? I don't want to follow a God who thinks the end justifies the means. I don't want to follow a God who sees my well-being as expendable for some secret divine goal. That's not hopeful for me. I reject that Auschwitz, a cancer diagnosis, the loss of a child is ever God's plan. I don't want to follow a God who plans for those kinds of things. Observation. There is a way to think and talk about God that is toxic and harmful for those who are suffering. So to turn this into the positive, there is a way to think and to talk about God that is tender and hopeful for anyone who is suffering. Now, Humber Valley, I know we're still very much getting to know each other, but one of the things you're going to learn quickly about me is that my understanding of God is really not that complicated. A bunch of theology degrees, and I've been a minister for a while. But all of that boils down to this really quickly. And it all comes down to this. God has to be at least as nice as Jesus. Period. That's it. All of my kind of theology, all of my thinking, all of my ministerial, pastoral training boils down to God has to be at least as nice as Jesus. And this isn't new, right? This isn't like mine. This is the essence of what Christianity is. God reveals God's self in the person of Jesus. Like if you want to know what God is like, if you want to know who God is, the first and the last place you should look is to Jesus. That's why in John chapter 14, verse 9, Jesus says, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Like if you've seen me, you've seen God. Or Colossians 2:9, the Apostle Paul insists, for in Christ, all the fullness of the deity, like all the wholeness, all the completeness of God lives in bodily form. Or John chapter 1, where the apostle says, Christ is the Word. Like Jesus is exactly what God wants to say to the world. If you want to know what God is like, if you want to know what God does, if you want to know who God is, dive deep into exploring Christ. God has to be at least as nice as Jesus. So what does that mean for the one who suffers? I think it means everything. It means that in looking at Christ, God isn't the one who comes with some plan to cause you pain, but with a love and a compassion that meets you and steps into your pain. A God who cries with us, a God who knows what loneliness and loss and isolation feels like, a God who's felt forsaken and forgotten. The one, remember, Christ is the one who calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Jesus, we see a God who always chooses healing over harm. A God who is born into poverty and amidst a genocide. A God who doesn't stand outside of the worst kind of human suffering, inflicting it, but who enters into it, bringing hope for victims and possibility of redemption for the oppressor. I don't know who needs to hear this today, but friend, God is not out to get you. God isn't pulling the strings to teach you a lesson through tragedy. I don't know which God would do that, but it's not the God revealed in Christ. So what does it mean for us to follow Jesus? It means that we can trust that God is only ever for us. It means that God is never causing the harm. It means that God is seeking out the brokenhearted, the grieving, the forgotten, the depressed, and the lonely. And to follow God is to risk our lives doing the same. There is so much I don't know and I've yet to learn. But I'm pretty sure of this. As simple and as whimsical as it may seem, God is at least as nice as Jesus. And this is the gospel of Jesus Christ.